October 14th, 1947, Muroc Dry Lake, California. Chuck Yeager climbs out of the Bell X-1 with 2 cracked ribs and a quiet smile. The headlines will call him the first man to break the sound barrier. Every aviation textbook printed for the next 80 years will say the same thing. But 5 years earlier, on a cold November morning off the coast of Connecticut, another young American pilot flew so fast in a machine, so unprepared for what he was about to do, that when he landed, the engineers at Republic Aviation believed he had gone faster than sound. His name was Harold Comstock. He was 21 years old. For 72 hours, he was a national hero. The New York papers ran his picture. Ripley's Believe It or Not drew a cartoon of his airplane. And then, on the morning of November 16th, 1942, a Western Union telegram arrived from the office of General Henry Harley Arnold, commander of the entire United States Army Air Forces. The message ordered every officer at Republic to cease all discussion of Lieutenant Comstock's flight. Immediately, permanently. The story was buried for the rest of the war. The men who lived through what came next paid for that silence in blood. This is the story the United States government did not want told. To understand why the Army would bury one of the 2 strangest test flights in American aviation history, you have to understand what a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt actually was, and what nobody yet knew it could do. In the autumn of 1942, on a stretch of Long Island called Farmingdale, there stood a factory unlike any other in the world. Republic Aviation Corporation. Inside its assembly halls, thousands of workers, women in coveralls, men too old for the draft, refugees from occupied Europe, bent metal into the shape of a fighter plane. But this fighter was different. This fighter was a monster. 7 tons. 17,500 pounds fully loaded. An 18-cylinder radial engine the size of a small automobile, delivering 2,000 horsepower. 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. A cockpit lined with armor plate thick enough to stop a rifle round. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. The man who designed it was named Alexander Kartveli. He was 46 years old, born in Tiflis in the old Russian Empire, in a corner of the Caucasus that would later be called the Republic of Georgia. Educated in Paris. Fled the Russian Revolution with nothing but a slide rule and an obsession. He did not look like an aviation pioneer. He looked like a grandfather. He wore 3-piece suits in the drafting room. He chain-smoked. He spoke 5 languages, none of them without an accent. But when Alexander Kartveli looked at a blueprint, he saw the future. In 1940, when the U.S. Army Air Corps told him they wanted a small, light interceptor to match the German Messerschmitt, Kartveli said no. He said the future belonged to a different kind of fighter, a fighter built around the largest, most powerful engine America could manufacture, a fighter that could climb to 40,000 feet, a fighter that could carry more armor, more guns, and more fuel than anything the Germans could put in the sky. They laughed at him. Then he built it. By November of 1942, the first production P-47C Thunderbolts were rolling off the Farmingdale line. The Army designated them fighters. The pilots who flew them called them jugs, because they looked like milk jugs, because they were fat, because they were ugly. But the pilots also knew something was wrong with the airplane. They did not talk about it in the briefing rooms. They talked about it in the barracks, late at night, after the whiskey had loosened their tongues. They talked about the test pilots at Republic who had gone up in the Thunderbolt on high-altitude flights and never come home. Airplanes that had spiraled into the ground at speeds no engineer could explain. Impact craters so deep that the recovery crews needed shovels and a full day just to find the identification tags. The Army called it pilot error. Alexander Kartveli called it a problem he did not yet understand. 60 miles north of the Farmingdale factory, across the waters of Long Island Sound, sat a small municipal airfield in Stratford, Connecticut. It was called Bridgeport Municipal. In the summer of 1942, the United States Army Air Forces had moved a brand new fighter unit onto that field, the 56th Fighter Group. 3 squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts, the first American combat unit to be equipped with the Jug. The commander of the 63rd Fighter Squadron was training a young lieutenant that autumn who had reported for duty on the 20th of July. His name was Harold Elwood Comstock. He was 5'10", thin, dark-haired, 21 years old, born in December of 1920, an Eagle Scout in the Boy Scouts of America. He had started flying at 15 years old, teaching himself in old rented biplanes at a country airfield. He had joined the Army Air Corps in early 1941, months before Pearl Harbor. He had passed every check ride on the first attempt. His wife had given him the nickname Bunny Nose. When his fellow pilots found out, they shortened it to Bunny, and the name stuck for the rest of his life. His wingman that autumn was a 22-year-old lieutenant named Roger Dyer, another young pilot in the pipeline, another face in the crowd. Neither man knew, in November of 1942, that only one of them would come home from the war. Because Republic Aviation was producing the P-47 so fast that they could not test every airplane themselves, because the war was hungrier for fighters than any factory could feed. The Army Air Forces began using active duty pilots from the 56th Fighter Group for acceptance testing. New airplanes would come out of the Farmingdale factory. They would be flown across Long Island Sound to Bridgeport, and the young pilots of the 56th would take them up to verify that they met specifications before being handed over to combat squadrons. Comstock and Dyer were on that list. On the morning of November 13th, 1942, they were handed an assignment that had nothing to do with dive testing. Republic had installed a new type of radio antenna on the P-47C. The engineers wanted to know how it performed at high altitude. 2 aircraft, 2 pilots. A simple test. Climb to 50,000 feet, verify radio contact, return to base. That was the flight plan. That was all it was supposed to be. At 0800 that morning, Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer walked out onto the tarmac at Bridgeport Municipal Airport. The sky was clear. The temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Their 2 silver P-47C Thunderbolts sat gleaming in the low autumn sun, engines already warming, propellers turning slow arcs against the pale sky. Comstock climbed into the cockpit. He would remember later that his hands were not shaking. He would remember that he was calm. He would remember thinking that this was going to be a good day. He was wrong. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp-end engine came alive with a sound like distant thunder rolling across the plains of Kansas. 18 cylinders, 46 liters of displacement, 2,000 horsepower, breathing through a turbo supercharger, the size of a beer keg mounted in the belly of the airplane. Comstock felt it through the seat of his flight suit. through his boots, through his teeth. He looked to his right. 50 feet away on the taxiway, Roger Dyer gave him a slow, deliberate thumbs up. Two young men, two silver airplanes. One clear November morning. They rolled to the end of the runway at Bridgeport. Comstock pushed the throttle forward. The Thunderbolt gathered itself like a bull, settling its weight before a charge, and then it began to move. 50 miles per hour, 80, 120. The tailwheel came off the concrete. The main gear lifted. The Connecticut shoreline dropped away beneath him, and Harold Comstock was flying. The climb took time. The P-47 was heavy, and even with its turbo-supercharged engine, the air above 40,000 feet was thin enough to test any airplane. Comstock climbed on instruments, on oxygen, watching the altimeter turn slowly clockwise. 30,035, 40. The temperature outside the canopy dropped past 40 degrees below zero. Frost formed in the corners of the windscreen. His flight suit could not keep out the cold. At 49,600 feet, the airplane began to fight him. The target was 50,000. He could not reach it. The controls were mushy, unresponsive. The airplane was staggering at the edge of a stall. 3,000 feet higher than any P-47 in production, had a right to fly. If he tried to pull up any further, he would spin. If he spun at 49,000 feet in a jug, he would not recover in time. Comstock made a decision. He pushed the stick forward and let the airplane fall off. He did not intend to enter a full-power vertical dive. He intended to nose down, recover altitude, and level off in denser air where the airplane could actually fly. That was the plan. The Thunderbolt had other ideas. For the first 5 seconds of the descent, it felt normal. The engine howled. The airframe vibrated in the familiar way of any aircraft in a steep dive. The airspeed indicator began to climb. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. At 450 miles per hour, everything changed. The vibration doubled, then tripled. It was no longer the smooth rhythm of engine and airflow. It was violence. The instrument panel became a blur. The rivets on the canopy frame began to chatter like a jackhammer. Comstock's oxygen mask beat against his face. His helmet slammed against the canopy. He could taste blood in his mouth from biting his own tongue. The airspeed indicator kept climbing. 500, 550, 600. He passed through 40,000 feet, still accelerating. And then Harold Comstock discovered what had killed the test pilots before him. The control stick began to move, not the way he wanted it to move, on its own, as if some invisible hand had reached into the cockpit and taken hold. The stick pushed forward, deeper. The nose of the airplane, already pointed steeply toward the earth, tried to go past vertical, to pitch under, to turn the dive into something worse than a dive, a tumble. Comstock grabbed the stick with both hands. He pulled back. The stick did not move. He pulled harder. He pulled until the veins in his neck bulged against the collar of his flight suit. He pulled until his shoulders felt like they were tearing out of their sockets. He pulled until his triceps burned and his vision started to gray at the edges. Nothing. The stick had become part of the airplane. Solid, immovable, a piece of steel welded into the floor of the cockpit. He stomped on the left rudder pedal. It did not move. He stomped on the right. It did not move. Below him, 7 miles of empty air, and falling fast. 28,000 feet, 25,000, 22,000. The altimeter needle was moving in a way Comstock had never seen an altimeter move. Not ticking down, not sweeping, spinning, like the second hand on a clock, only faster, 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 until it became a blur. The airspeed indicator was pinned at the maximum reading on the dial, 725 miles per hour. That was not possible. The engineers at Republic had told him the red line for the P-47C was 500 miles per hour. They had told him the airframe would not survive anything faster. He was doing 725, and the airplane was not braking. But the airplane was not responding either. Somewhere behind and above him, Roger Dyer was going through the same nightmare in his own cockpit. Later, when the two of them were on the ground and had time to speak, Dyer would describe the feeling in words that made the newspapers print them exactly as he said them. "My body was pushed back against the rear armor plate," he would say. "I had a feeling that any second the plane was going to pull away from me and leave me stranded right there, 5 miles above the ground. It's a breathless feeling. Your stomach curls up. It's something like stepping from a hot shower to a cold one." But there was no time to describe it in the cockpit. There was only time to survive it. Or not. In the cockpit of aircraft with the fresh Republic paint still drying on its rudder, Harold Comstock was too busy dying to think about anything else. He was going through the checklist in his head. Every emergency procedure the Army had taught him. Every trick the old pilots at Kelly Field had whispered to him after too many drinks. He was running through them one by one, and one by one they were failing. Cut the throttle, already tried. The engine did not care. Deploy the flaps, the lever refused to move. At this airspeed, the hydraulic pressure could not push the flap surfaces into the slipstream. Roll inverted, then pull. He could not roll. The ailerons were locked. Bail out. He was doing 700 miles per hour. If he blew the canopy, the wind would tear his head off before he cleared the tail. If he cleared the tail, the airstream would rip his parachute into confetti before it opened. There was one thing left. The P-47 had a small hand crank mounted on the cockpit floor. It was not part of the main flight controls. It was an emergency backup, a manual crank that adjusted the small elevator trim tabs on the tail. The tabs were tiny, the size of a dinner plate. Under normal flight, they helped balance the airplane. They were not designed to fly a thunderbolt out of a runaway dive. But the tabs were the only thing left on the tail that was not frozen solid. Comstock reached down. He grabbed the crank. He began to turn it. He turned it slowly at first, then harder. The airplane groaned around him. The tail surfaces creaked. Somewhere in the airframe, metal was flexing in ways the engineers had not designed it to flex. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then he felt it, a twitch, a shudder deep in the airframe. The trim tabs, moving 1 degree at a time, began to bite into the slipstream. They created a tiny force, a whisper of aerodynamic pressure on the tail. But at 725 miles per hour, even a whisper is enough. Comstock kept cranking. The nose of the P-47 began to lift. He would say, later, in the only interview he ever gave about that day, that when the tabs finally engaged, the airplane felt like it had been hit by a truck. That was the phrase he used. Because when the elevator finally caught the airflow again, the aerodynamic force was so violent that Comstock was slammed back into the armored plate behind his seat, as if a large man had kicked him in the chest. The G-forces hit him next. Positive G, dragging the blood out of his brain. His vision going gray, going black at the edges. He groaned against the pressure. He tensed his legs. He clenched his stomach muscles. He did every anti-G maneuver the instructors at Kelly Field had taught him, and it was almost not enough. He bottomed out at low altitude over the waters of Long Island Sound. The horizon that had been a distant memory somewhere above him sliced back down into his windscreen. The gray Atlantic was underneath him. The Connecticut shoreline was to his left. He was alive. He climbed back up slowly, every joint in his body aching. His hands trembling on the controls, blood in his mouth. Blood on his flight gloves from where he had bitten his tongue. Somewhere off his wing, Roger Dyer was climbing up beside him. Dyer had gone through the same thing. Dyer had recovered the same way. The two young men flew back to Bridgeport in silence, neither one trusting himself to speak on the radio. They landed. The crew chief who met them on the ramp took one look at Comstock's face and stopped whatever he was about to say. Comstock was the color of paper. His flight suit was soaked through with sweat despite the November cold. There was dried blood on his chin. The crew chief did not ask what had happened. He said quietly, "Lieutenant, let's get you out of there." The debriefing that afternoon lasted for hours. Comstock and Dyer told the operations officer everything they could remember. The altitude. The airspeed indicator pinned at 725. The frozen controls. The elevator trim tabs. The way the airplane had shuddered when the tabs finally bit. 2 days later, engineers from Republic Aviation drove up from Farmingdale to interview them personally. They brought Alexander Kartveli with them. The old Georgian sat across the table from Comstock and Dyer with a fresh notebook and a fresh pack of cigarettes. He asked them the same questions 3 different ways. He wrote down every word. He did not smile. When the 2 young pilots had finished telling their story for the 3rd time, Kartveli closed his notebook. He said, in his heavy accent, "You have flown my airplane faster than the speed of sound." Comstock did not know how to answer. Kartveli said it again, slower this time, as if he needed to hear himself say it out loud. "Faster than sound." That was all he said. 2 weeks passed, and then, on the 1st of December 1942, Republic Aviation issued a press release. The release stated that on November 13th, 2 Army lieutenants had flown their P-47 Thunderbolt fighters at 725 miles per hour in a power dive from 35,000 feet. It stated that this speed exceeded the speed of sound at high altitude. It stated that the pilots had used emergency cranks to move the elevator trim tabs and pull their airplanes out of the dive. The response was immediate. The Associated Press wire carried the story to every newspaper in America, and the New York Times ran it. The Herald Tribune ran it. The Chicago Tribune ran it. Life magazine sent a photographer to Bridgeport. Robert Ripley, the cartoonist behind the syndicated Believe It or Not feature, published a drawing of a P-47 Thunderbolt with a caption declaring that 2 young American lieutenants had broken the sound barrier. For 72 hours, Harold Comstock was famous. His parents read about him in their local newspaper. His wife cut out the clipping and kept it in a Bible. And then, in mid-December of 1942, a Western Union telegram arrived at the operations building of the 56th Fighter Group at Bridgeport. It was signed by General Henry Harley Arnold, commander of the entire United States Army Air Forces, direct from his office at the Munitions Building in Washington, D.C. The message was short. It ordered all discussion of the flight of November 13th to cease immediately. It ordered all photographs, film footage, and written reports related to the flight to be classified. It ordered Republic Aviation to be quiet. It ordered the pilots to be quiet. It promised court-martial for any officer, pilot, engineer, or civilian employee who spoke of the incident again. Within days, Alexander Kartveli had been personally reprimanded by an officer flown in from Washington. Republic Aviation issued a formal statement announcing that the earlier press release had been based on preliminary data, now known to be inaccurate. The Ripley cartoon was quietly withdrawn from syndication. The Life magazine spread was killed before printing, and Harold Comstock called into a windowless room at the back of the operations building, was informed that his flight of November 13th had not been what he thought it was. He was told he had not exceeded the speed of sound. He was told the airspeed indicator had been mistaken. He was told that any conversation he might have with anyone, his parents, his wife, his fellow pilots, a chaplain, a bartender, about the events of November 13th would result in his immediate court-martial for revealing classified military information in a time of war. He was told to sign a document acknowledging that he understood. He signed it. He was 21 years old, and he understood one thing very clearly. The United States government did not want to know what he had survived, because if the government admitted the truth about November 13th, even if they later determined he had not actually broken the sound barrier, they would have to admit something worse. They would have to admit that the P-47 Thunderbolt, the most expensive American fighter of the war, could enter a dive at high altitude and become uncontrollable. They would have to admit that pilots were dying in training accidents that nobody at Republic Aviation yet knew how to prevent. In November of 1942, less than a year after Pearl Harbor, 4 months into a war the Allies were still losing, that admission was impossible. So the truth was buried, and Harold Comstock returned to duty. He shipped out to England with the 56th Fighter Group in early 1943. He flew combat missions over Germany with the 63rd Fighter Squadron. He shot down 5 enemy aircraft. He became an ace. He came home in 1945, and he never spoke about November 13th for the rest of his life. Roger Dyer, his wingman, would not be so lucky. Dyer was killed in action over Europe on the 26th of June, 1943. He was 22 years old. He had flown the dive of November 13th. He had survived 13th. He had survived the impossible. He had helped prove that a 47 Thunderbolt could reach speeds no engineer had believed possible. And then, 7 months later, he was shot out of the sky by a German fighter over the fields of northern France, and his body was buried in a small American military cemetery. His name is on the classified reports. His name is not on any monument, but other pilots were still going to die. Because the problem, Kartveli had confessed at that interview table, did not go away just because the government had classified it. Because the young pilots of the 56th Fighter Group and the 4th and the 78th were about to go into combat over France in machines nobody yet understood. Because the Focke-Wulf pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 were about to discover that if you rolled inverted and dove for the deck in front of an American Thunderbolt, the American would follow you down and never come back up. And because, on the other side of the Atlantic, in a small English airfield called Bovingdon, a 35-year-old officer named Cass Hoff had just been given the assignment of his lifetime. Cass Hoff was not going to leave the puzzle alone. He was going to fly the same dive Harold Comstock had flown. On purpose. Again and again and again. Cass Sperry Huff was born in the town of Plymouth, Michigan, in the summer of 1907. His father and grandfather had built one of the most famous American manufacturers of youth firearms, the Daisy Manufacturing Company. Cass grew up in the family business. He worked on the manufacturing floor. He knew the men on his father's crew by name. He knew their children's names. He also loved airplanes. In the 1930s, in his own time, on his own money, Cass Hoff became one of the best amateur aviators in the American Midwest. He flew barnstorming shows. He gave rides to farmers. He walked away from crashes that should have killed him. When the United States entered the war in December of 1941, he left the family business to enlist. He was 34 years old. By the winter of 1942, the Army Air Forces had made him a lieutenant colonel and assigned him to the technical section of the 8th Fighter Command in England, working under Colonel Ben Kelsey. Their job was to keep American fighter pilots alive over Europe. It was not glamorous work. It was not command work. It was engineering, testing, and problem-solving under the pressure of a war being lost one squadron at a time. Huff read the classified files that came across his desk in the spring of 1943. He read the reports from the 4th Fighter Group and the 78th and the 56th, describing pilots who had rolled onto their backs to chase a German Focke-Wulf and never come back up. He read the accident reports on the P-38 Lightning, an aircraft that was killing its own pilots even faster than combat was. The P-38 had earned a nickname in the training pipeline that summer, the Widow Maker. He read all of it. And then, in the early spring of 1943, Cass Huff went to General Frank O'Driscoll Hunter, the commander of the 8th Fighter Command, and requested permission to conduct a series of dive tests in an operational P-47 Thunderbolt, and later in a P-38 Lightning. Hunter asked him what he expected to prove. Huff said he expected to find out what was killing his pilots. Hunter reminded him that General Arnold had already ordered all such discussions to cease. Huff said he was aware of that. Hunter looked at him for a long moment. Then he signed the paperwork. He did not put his signature at the bottom of any official memorandum. He did not enter the flights into any squadron log. He simply gave Cass Huff an airplane, a wingman, and a clear morning, and Huff went up. He climbed to 35,000 feet. He rolled inverted. He pulled the same dive Harold Comstock had pulled the previous November over Long Island Sound. The results were the same. The controls locked at 450 miles per hour. The airframe began to shake. The airspeed indicator climbed past 600. The stick froze. The engine screamed. And Cass Hoff, 35 years old, husband, father, factory heir from Plymouth, Michigan, rode a 7-ton lawn dart down through the English clouds until the thicker air near the ground allowed him to pull out at 3,000 feet. He landed. He wrote a report. The next morning, he did it again, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Between the spring and autumn of 1943, Cass Huff flew the compressibility dive many times. He varied his entry altitude. He varied his entry speed. He varied his dive angle. He tried every recovery technique any pilot had ever suggested. He landed one afternoon with the fabric on his elevators peeled halfway off from the aerodynamic stress. He blacked out from G-forces on more than one occasion. He came home from one flight so shaken that his ground crew found him sitting in the cockpit for 10 minutes before he could stand up. He filed his reports up the chain of command. The reports went to Wright Field in Ohio, and the American pilots kept dying. By the summer of 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had lost more men to accidents than to enemy action. Captain Robert Johnson, one of their leading aces, later wrote in his memoir Thunderbolt that he watched friends die in what the pilots were now openly calling the graveyard spiral. The men in the ready rooms whispered about it. The chaplains prayed about it. The crew chiefs painted crude warnings on the instrument panels of new arrivals. Do not chase Germans in a dive. Do not follow the Fokker-Wulf down. The problem was, the young pilots did not always listen. They were 19, they were 20. They were farm boys from Iowa, and Beek steelworks from Pittsburgh, and the sons of Polish immigrants from Chicago, and they had been raised on stories of the aces of the Great War. And when a German fighter rolled onto its back and dove for the deck in front of them, every instinct they had ever developed told them to follow. And they followed, and they died. By the autumn of 1943, Cass Huff had come to a conclusion that his classified reports could not say out loud. He had concluded that the problem was not the pilots. The problem was the airplane. The problem was in the shape of the wing, in the thickness of the airfoil, in the way the air itself behaved when it was forced to move over that wing at more than 70% of the speed of sound. The problem, in other words, was in the science. And the science did not yet exist, but it was being written. At the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics facility at Langley Field in Virginia, a young aeronautical engineer named John Stack had been working the problem in wind tunnels since 1942. Stack had figured out, before anyone else in America, that what the pilots were calling compressibility was actually a shockwave phenomenon on the wings and tail. He had published his findings in classified reports of his own. At Lockheed's Burbank plant in California, Kelly Johnson, the same engineer who had designed the P-38 Lightning in the first place, was leading a team that would apply Stack's science to a solution. That solution came in the form of 4 small metal panels, 4 flat rectangles of aluminum, each about the size of a dinner plate, mounted underneath the wings of a fighter aircraft, folded flat against the airfoil during normal flight. At the touch of a switch in the cockpit, an electric motor would extend those 4 panels down into the slipstream. They were called dive recovery flaps. The idea was not to slow the airplane down. The idea was to change the airflow. When the panels extended, they created a small, controlled disturbance in the air moving over the underside of the wing. That disturbance would push the center of lift forward. It would restore the pitch balance the airplane had lost at high speed. It would allow the elevators to bite again. It would allow the pilot to pull out. Lockheed installed the first dive recovery flaps on production P-38 Lightnings in the spring of 1944. Republic followed later that year with a modified version installed on the P-47 D-27RE. Across the Atlantic in the fighter squadrons of the 8th Air Force, the retrofit kits began arriving through the summer, and American pilots stopped dying in compressibility dives. Not all of them, not immediately. The knowledge took time to spread. The retrofit kits took time to install on older airframes. The old fighters in the training pipeline kept killing young men well into 1945. But by the autumn of 1944, in the fighter squadrons of the 8th Air Force, a young man from Iowa who followed a German Focke-Wulf into a vertical dive was no longer signing his own death warrant. He was flying an airplane that could get him back, and nobody, in all of that time, ever told him who to thank. The government never declassified the reports from November of 1942 during the war. Alexander Kartvel's name never appeared in a newspaper alongside the story of the P-47. Cass Hoff became a modest, small-town celebrity when Reader's Digest published a profile of him in February of 1944, but the article carefully avoided mentioning what he had actually risked. And Harold Comstock, the 21-year-old, who had gone faster than any American pilot had ever officially gone, went home to civilian life in the summer of 1945 with 5 German aircraft to his credit, the silver bars of a captain on his shoulders, and 47 years of silence about November 13th. He did not talk about it, not to his wife, not to his children, not to his fellow veterans, not to the reporters who occasionally called to ask about his combat service in the 56th Fighter Group. In July of 1944, at Wright Field in Ohio, a 30-year-old test pilot named Major Frederick Austin Borsodi climbed into a P-51D Mustang and flew a series of full-power vertical dives from 40,000 feet. He reached a Mach number of 0.86. He documented the same phenomena Harold Comstock had experienced. He confirmed, on paper, in official Army Air Forces test reports, everything Alexander Kartveli and John Stack had suspected. His data was not classified. His data was used to redesign the wings of every American fighter that came after him. Fred Borsodi was killed 6 months later, in December of 1944, when a Mustang he was test flying broke up in a dive. He was 31 years old. His widow received a telegram from the War Department that did not mention the dives. On October 14th, 1947, 5 years and 11 months after Harold Comstock's flight over Long Island Sound, a 24-year-old Air Force captain named Charles Elwood Yeager was released from the belly of a B-29 Superfortress at 20,000 feet above Muroc-Dry Lake in the California desert. He was strapped into the cockpit of a Bell X-1 rocket plane. 2 days earlier, he had cracked 2 ribs falling off a horse. He had told nobody at the base. He was afraid that if he reported the injury, they would ground him. He fired the rocket engine. The X-1 climbed to 43,000 feet, and at approximately 10:18 in the morning, Pacific Standard Time, Chuck Yeager exceeded the speed of sound in level flight, becoming, according to every American history book ever printed, the first human being to break the sound barrier. The X-1 was equipped with a small horizontal stabilizer on the tail that could be adjusted in flight. That attachment allowed Yeager to maintain pitch control at speeds where a conventional elevator, like the one on Harold Comstock's P-47 Thunderbolt, would have locked solid in the slipstream. The men who designed the X-1 knew that this feature was necessary because of a phenomenon called compressibility. They knew about compressibility because of the classified reports filed by a lieutenant colonel named Cass Hoff. They knew about survivable recovery techniques because of the engineering work of Alexander Kartveli, John Stack, and Kelly Johnson. And they knew about the human experience of the dive itself because of the flight of a 21-year-old lieutenant named Harold Comstock on a clear November morning in 1942, 5 years before Yeager, over the waters off Bridgeport, Connecticut. None of those men were invited to Muroc Dry Lake on October 14th, 1947. None of them were mentioned in the press releases. Chuck Yeager, who would go on to become one of the most famous test pilots in American history, would spend the rest of his long life being introduced at air shows and dinners and White House receptions as the first man to break the sound barrier. And he was, in a straight and level airplane, in an aircraft specifically designed to survive the transition, with an entire ground crew of engineers standing by to help him. It was a legitimate achievement. Yeager deserves the honors. But he was not the first man to fly a machine that fast. Harold Comstock had done that 5 years earlier, alone, by accident, at the age of 21. In an airplane the United States government had ordered him never to speak of again. Alexander Kartveli died in Great Neck, New York, in July of 1974. He was 77 years old. His obituary in the New York Times ran to 5 paragraphs. It mentioned the P-47 Thunderbolt. It mentioned the F-84 and the F-105 and the A-10 Warthog, all of which he designed after the war. It did not mention compressibility. It did not mention Harold Comstock. Cass Huff returned to the Daisy Manufacturing Company after the war and eventually became its president. He died in the summer of 1990 at the age of 82. His obituary in the local Michigan papers described him as a retired businessman. Some of the older articles mentioned that he had flown some kind of experimental dives during the war. The younger papers did not mention it at all. Roger Dyer had already been dead for 47 years by the time Cass Huff was buried. Roger Dyer has been dead for 83 years as of this recording. He was 22 years old when he flew the dive, 22 when he was killed in combat. His grave is in an American military cemetery in Europe. Almost nobody visits it. Harold Comstock lived the longest of the 4. He died on the 3rd of April 2009 in his home at the age of 88. In the last years of his life, after the classified files from November of 1942 had finally been quietly declassified by the Department of Defense, Harold Comstock gave a small number of interviews. He spoke to a few aviation historians. He allowed his story to be included in a Wikipedia entry. He confirmed, gently, that on the 13th of November 1942, he had done something with an airplane that nobody at Republic Aviation had thought was possible. He was never bitter about the silence. He said, in one of those late life interviews, that the government had done what the government thought it needed to do in 1942. He said he understood. He said he had lived a good life. He said he had loved his wife. He said he had raised his children. He said he had flown other airplanes after the war, bigger ones, faster ones, jets that would have been science fiction to the boy who had climbed into that P-47C at Bridgeport in November of 1942. He was asked once what he remembered most about the dive. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said quietly that he remembered the silence. He remembered the moment after the trim tabs finally engaged. The moment when the airplane came back to life in his hands, and the way the engine had suddenly sounded quieter, and the way the world had seemed to slow down. He remembered climbing back to altitude beside Roger Dyer in silence. He remembered landing at Bridgeport in silence. He remembered walking to the debriefing in silence. He said he had not understood then what that silence meant. He said he understood it now. He said, the silence was the sound of a country that had won a war and was trying to figure out how to bury the parts it did not want to remember. The dive recovery flap installed on the P-38 Lightning and the P-47D-27 RE Thunderbolt in the spring and summer of 1944 was the first practical solution to transonic pitch control in the history of aviation. Every jet fighter built after 1945 owes something to it. The speed brakes on the F-86 Sabre in Korea, the variable stabilator on the F-4 Phantom in Vietnam, the fly-by-wire pitch compensation on the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the flight control laws on the F-35 Lightning II that rolls off the Lockheed Martin assembly line in Fort Worth, Texas today. All of it traces back to 4 small metal panels bolted underneath the wings of fighter aircraft in 1944, designed by an old Georgian immigrant in New York and a young engineer in Virginia and an aviation genius in California, working long into the nights while young men their own age flew and died in the sky over Europe. And behind those 4 panels, if you look closely enough, you can see the shadow of a 21-year-old lieutenant named Harold Comstock, a wingman, Roger Dyer, and an airfield at Morning in 1942. When 2 young Americans discovered by accident what the entire American aviation industry did not yet know how to say, that the sky itself at a certain speed would try to kill you, that the only way to find out how to survive it was to fly straight into it, and that the men who did the flying were rarely the men who got remembered. If you believe that story deserves to be told, that the men who paid in blood so that a boy from Kansas or a mechanic from Ohio could come home to his mother in 1945 deserve to be remembered by name, then leave their names in the comments below. Harold Comstock, Roger Dyer, Cass Hoff, Alexander Kartveli, Fred Borsody. Say them out loud, because for the better part of 80 years, the United States government would not. And history is only remembered by the people who refuse to let it be forgotten.
Infantrymen. They stormed the Barrett Heights